So in the next session, we're going to spend some time talking about how we can counter systemic abandonment and its devastating effects with using systemic change to our ministry systems and the way that we operate. But before we get to that, I thought it would be helpful and wise for us to look at some of the themes that we see in Scripture that actually give us the impetus and the direction to actually want to work towards that change. You see, what we're going to talk about in this session is important. Because in what we're going to look at, we're going to find the answer to the question of why we even need to be proactive in responding to this crisis as a church. Why it can't just be enough for mental health professionals to do this, but also why we need to recognize the role that we have in an adolescent's healing. So in this session, we're going to examine two biblical mandates that we find in the Bible, and then we're going to look at the subsequent responses that we need to have as a church or parachurch to them. So let's look at the first mandate. It's simply this. It's to embrace those who are on the fringes of the society. Now, if you were to look through the Old Testament, you would find that there are a lot of verses that would command the Israelites to do this, but I want to call your attention to one in particular. It comes out of Leviticus 19:33. It says, "When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall do him no wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." You see, all throughout the Torah, which are the first 5 books of the Bible, in these first 5 books, they outline the laws and the rituals for the people of Israel. We see that God is repeatedly calling them to practice an ethic of love and hospitality towards those people who found themselves on the fringes of society. This included widows and people who were sick and even strangers. You see, this practice of hospitality is featured prominently everywhere throughout the Old Testament. You find it in the patriarchal stories. You find it in the law, in the book of Judges, in the prophets, as the people of God are called to care for, protect, feed, clothe, and embrace those who had come to them in need of help. This theme of love and embrace is present throughout the entirety of the Mosaic Law, and it has direct implications for the ways in which the church today is called to respond to those who are on the fringes of society. And for us, in this context, that actually includes our students who are dealing with mental health disorders. And you know this because you're deeply aware they are often the ones who are not considered. They are often the ones who are pushed to the side and ignored. Well, in the same way that the Israelites were called to care for the strangers, the widows, and the orphans, the people of God, right? Us as youth workers, we are called to embrace those who are on the outside as if they were on the inside. Because it is only when they are in the inside, a part of our community, that they will begin to experience belonging, healing, and wholeness. Right, so if this is the mandate to embrace people, what's our response? Well, it's to move towards full inclusion. You see, in biblical times when people suffered from physical ailments, and back then mental health definitely would have been considered one of those, they were considered to be unclean. And depending on their particular condition and the severity, they were often driven away from society because people didn't know how to handle it, and quite frankly, they just didn't want to deal with it. In Mark 5, there are actually 2 accounts of interactions like this that Jesus had with people who had been experiencing this pain of rejection. There was a man who had been possessed by demons who was living in the region of the Decapolis. And then there was a woman who had an uncontrollable menstrual flow lasting 12 years. And in each of these encounters, what we see is that Jesus defies the cultural norms for how he should have responded. And this is significant. Because in doing this, Jesus is offering us a new way forward when considering the way that we're going to engage and the way that we're going to respond. You see, when you look at these 2 encounters that Jesus had, which you can read about if you want in Mark 5, we find that what Jesus is showing us is that isolation is never the solution that's going to bring healing. By engaging with these 2 people who are suffering, Jesus actually gave them a new shot at life. And it wasn't just going to be a shot at life on their own. It was going to be a new shot at life in community. And this life wasn't going to be defined by the things that they had gone through. It was going to be defined by what he was inviting them into. You see, this is a model for engagement and inclusion that we need to work towards expressing in our own response to those who our world would cast out, specifically in this case with students who are dealing with mental health disorders like anxiety and depression. Well, this brings us to the second mandate that we see in the Bible about how we're called to respond, and it's simply this: we've got to treat them with love and respect. Right, and the them here, that's the people who are on the fringes of society. You see, this mandate to love and embrace people who are on the fringes is not only in the Old Testament, right? This isn't just something the Israelites had to do. It's also something in the New Testament. We find it all throughout the gospel narratives and the teachings of Jesus. A great example of this is actually found in Matthew 25, 31 to 46, where when he was teaching about the final judgment that awaits believers, Jesus contrasts two groups of people based on the ways in which they responded to this need that was in front of them. And he called one group the faithful followers, and he called the other group the unfaithful followers. You see, Jesus took some time to detail the needs of the people who were around them, who would be considered on the fringes of society, right? Things like hunger and thirst and hospitality and the need for visitation when sick or in prison. And Jesus contrasts the ways in which the faithful and the unfaithful have responded to those who are in need, right? Did they step in? Did they meet the needs? But not only did he talk about how they responded, he also talked about the judgment that they were going to receive as a result of what they did or did not do. You see, the former, this would be the group that Jesus called faithful, they took time to meet the physical and the emotional needs of those who were on the fringes. And because of that, they were invited into the kingdom. The latter group, these are the unfaithful, they ignored both the physical and emotional needs of those who were on the fringes. And because of this, they were actually sent away from the kingdom and into judgment. What's evident is that for these two groups, one of them had actions that met the expectations of Jesus, and one of them didn't. And Jesus goes on to make a pretty profound statement that I think actually has some pretty significant implications for us. You see, he says that those acts that were done for the people who were in need, they weren't actually done for the people who were in need. They were done for Jesus himself. You see, what we see in this passage is not just a foreshadow of the judgment that's to come for the church. It definitely tells us that. But I think it also serves to provide a template for the behavior and the ethic that followers of Jesus who desire to step into the kingdom need to practice towards those who are considered to be the least of these in the eyes of our world. So how do we respond? Right? If that's what we're supposed to do, well, I think one thing we can definitely work towards is this, is we could fight to remove the negative stigma that's associated with anxiety, depression, and other mental health disorders. You see, removing the negative stigma, this is something that Jesus is all about. In John 9, 1 to 41, we find Jesus traveling with his disciples, and they see this guy who had been born blind from birth. And when they saw this man, Jesus' disciples said, "Hey, Jesus, whose fault is it?" Right? We're like, why is this guy blind? Is it his fault? Is it his parents' fault? You see, they had assumed, just like everybody else, that his suffering was due to sin and that the blindness he was experiencing was just a consequence. Jesus, though, you see, he doesn't embrace this kind of thinking. He rejects that logic. He answers his disciples by stating that it was actually neither this man nor his parents who had sinned, but that this illness had happened so that the power of God could be displayed in him. Jesus goes on to heal the man by sending him to the pool of Siloam to wash himself. And what I think is so important for us to see in this passage is that Jesus, unlike everybody else, didn't brand this man a sinner, implying that his blindness was a punishment for sin. Instead, what he did is this, is he separated the condition he was suffering from the value and the worth that he inherently had as a human being. This is important. Because in doing this, what Jesus does is he removes the negative stigma that is often associated with physical and mental health conditions. So here's what we've covered in this session. As Christians who are called to embrace those who are on the fringes of society, which means, we need to welcome people in who other people won't welcome in, right? This includes students who are dealing with mental health disorders. Like, we've got this mandate to do this. We've also got this call to love people, especially the people that other people struggle to love. And we love them in the same way that Jesus loved them. Right? We look past their condition. We don't define them by what they're suffering from. We see them for who they are. They're beloved sons. They're beloved daughters. And because we know this is who they are, we do everything that we can to remove every negative stigma that is associated with mental health disorders. These two mandates and their responses, they're going to be really important for us as we think through and craft what our response is going to be to this issue. And we're going to talk about that in session 5. But before we do that, I want to invite you to engage in the post-seminar reflection at the bottom of this page. Take some time to wrestle with it, to pray through it, to write your answers. And when you're done, meet us in the next session.